One New York banker representing the Rockefeller interests. And the seventh individual was Paul Warburg, who had come over from Germany from the House of Rothschild, was now with the Kuhn-Loeb Company, and was in fact the architect, the main creator of the Federal Reserve System. 25 years after this secret meeting held at Jekyll Island in Georgia, one of the bankers, Frank Vanderlip, wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post, sort of a commemoration of 25 years later. And he said in that article that I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. That was his term, and it was a well-put term. The Federal Reserve was sold to Congress as a guardian of the people's interests, and it was exactly the opposite. The Federal Reserve was given power to decide the amount of money in our country, the value of the currency, the rate of interest. They were given the power to create a boom or a bust at any time, and even to do so prior to an election to hurt or to help their favored candidate, and indeed they have done that. I mentioned the use of war to bring about more government, even world government. Hardly anyone in the United States wanted us to be in World War I, which had started in 1914. An incident was needed in order to get the United States involved, and that incident turned out to be the sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania, a British vessel. It was widely reported that the Lusitania was a civilian vessel, and it was simply transporting cruise ship type persons out on vacation. But the truth of the matter is that there were 6 million rounds of ammunition on it, plus other munitions. It was a registered cruiser of the British Navy, and during its fated voyage, the British had cracked the German code, and they knew where all of the U-boats, the German U-boats, were located. Nevertheless, the Lusitania was sent into the area where U-boats were known to exist at a reduced speed. It was hit by one torpedo, hit into the area where the ammunition was, and it was a huge hole blown in it, and it sank in a matter of moments. But the American people were not told all of the details about the Lusitania, just that these horrible Germans had sunk a passenger ship. 128 Americans died, British and others as well. People in our country were enraged. But what's interesting is that before the incident, Winston Churchill, then head of the British Admiralty, had ordered a report done to predict the political impact if a passenger ship was sunk carrying Americans. And the following conversation took place between Colonel Edward Mandell House and Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Minister. Grey said, "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers aboard?" And Edward Mandell House responded, "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States of America, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war." Many people died so that we could get into a war where many more died. Colonel House's book, Philip Drew, administrator, called for a League of Nations. President Wilson proposed exactly that in 1918. We did get involved in the war in 1917. Early in 1918, while the war was raging, President Wilson gave his famous 14-point speech. And in it, among other things, he called for a League of Nations, even before the war had ended. And so after the war was ended, the League of Nations was formed. And the United States Senate was given the responsibility of ratifying our entry into this. The United States Senate voted no. A return to normalcy began. That happened in 1919. But in 1919, during that time, when the Senate made that vote, Edward Mandell House and his young associates were over in Paris, working on the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I. They got word that the United States Senate had turned thumbs down on our entry into the League of Nations, and so they got together with their British counterparts, and they plotted to form organizations in their respective country to carry out the designs of the world government promoters. The The British formed the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the Americans formed the Council on Foreign Relations. House and his young associates included John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Christian Herter, Walter Lippmann, a very famous newspaper man. But the U.S. Senate had said no. Therefore, it was time for these people to put together organizations to propagandize Americans into wanting world government. And that's the Council on Foreign Relations. In the very second edition of the Council on Foreign Relations publication, Foreign Affairs, it discussed the real problem in the world is the need for world government. World government, of course, means scrap the U.S. Constitution, repeal the Declaration of Independence, give up America's sovereignty, get us involved in a world government. And so the Council began to spread its desires, and they even began to plan at that point for World War II. 1917, of course, the year that we entered the war, was also the year that the communists took control of Russia. A lot of people think that the Tsar was overthrown by the Russians, but he wasn't. The Tsar was overthrown by socialists led by a man named Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky overthrew the Tsar, and then the communists overthrew Kerensky later in the year. But what's interesting is that Lenin and Trotsky, who did accomplish that for the Bolsheviks, were not even in Russia when the Tsar was overthrown. Lenin was in Switzerland, Trotsky was in New York. Lenin was given a tremendous cache of money by a German banker and was helped to go through Germany in a sealed railroad car to get back into Russia. Trotsky was in New York, and one of the pivotal events of the 20th century took place when Trotsky left New York with $20 million given him by Jacob Schiff, a relative of the Warburgs, and into the banking establishments of Europe. And he started back with a contingent of Bolsheviks on a ship that stopped in Canada. And Canadian authorities came aboard the ship and arrested Trotsky. They did so for a very practical reason. The war was underway. Russia was fighting on one side of the war. The other side, the British, the French, the Americans, and the Canadians. And the Canadians theorized that if Trotsky and Lenin got back to Russia and did what they said they intended to do, which would be to take Russia out of the war, that would free up more German troops to go and kill Canadians and British and French and Americans. And so they arrested Trotsky and they held him until pressure was put upon the Canadian government to put him back on the ship. The pressure came from the White House in Washington, D.C., and it was largely the work of Edward Mandell House. House put pressure on President Wilson, persuaded him. President Wilson put pressure on the British government onto the Canadian government, and Trotsky got put back on the ship. And Trotsky and Lenin did succeed in establishing a communist base of operations, the first captive nation of the communist world in Russia in 1917. We move ahead now a little bit to the period of 1929 and the famous stock market crash. America during the 1920s experienced the period that was known as the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties, money was free, everybody was getting wealthy, people were investing in the stock market. What had happened is that the Federal Reserve greatly inflated the quantity of currency. And not only that, the situation was arranged where people could buy tremendous amounts of stock with just a percentage of the money. In other words, you could put down $100 and buy $1,000 worth of stock and have yourself be indebted. But of course, it was going to grow in its value so that you could then sell it and make money and pay off your loan and you'd be in clover. And a lot of people were doing this, except that at a given point in time, the Federal Reserve contracted the amount of currency and the banks started calling in the loans. And when they did that, people immediately had to sell their stocks, and all of a sudden stocks were being sold everywhere. The price of stocks went down, and that was the crash of 1929. It was all deliberate. It was blamed on the free enterprise system. The free enterprise system was not at fault. It was perversion of the free enterprise system that had allowed this whole thing to happen. Of interest is the fact that John D. Rockefeller and Bernard Baruch and Joseph P. Kennedy, whose son later became a president, got out of the stock market early, before the crash. And after